I was standing by the drinks table at my own grandson's graduation party, wearing the same Navy work jacket I'd worn to 100 backyard barbecues, when I heard him introduce me to his new boss. "That's my grandpa, Frank. Don't mind him, he's just a broke old handyman. Spent his whole life fixing stuff for people. Sweet guy, though." He laughed when he said it. So did the young woman next to him, a recruiter from the company that had just hired him, standing maybe 8 feet away, close enough that I heard every word clearly over the music. I didn't say anything. I just picked up my lemonade, nodded at both of them like I hadn't heard a thing, and walked back toward the patio. Because in 11 days, that same recruiter's company was going to fly me out for a quarterly board meeting. The company I'd started in my garage 41 years ago, and the one where my grandson was about to learn, on his very first day, exactly whose name was on the wall behind the reception desk. My name is Frank. I'm 70 years old, and for most of my life, I've gone out of my way to look like exactly what my grandson called me that day, a guy who fixes things. Work boots, a jacket with a coffee stain that's been there longer than some of my grandkids have been alive, a 15-year-old pickup truck with 230,000 miles on it that I have zero intention of replacing. That's not an accident. That's a decision I made a long time ago for reasons that have very little to do with money and everything to do with what money did to my own father. In 1985, I started a precision machining business out of my garage with $11,000 I'd saved and a single contract to make custom valve components for a regional water utility. I named it Meridian Fabrication, after the Meridian survey line that ran through the property my father had farmed and eventually lost, a small, stubborn way of making sure that failure meant something instead of nothing. For the first 6 years, my wife Doris did the books at our kitchen table while I ran the machines myself, sometimes 18 hours a day, and we genuinely did not know, most months, whether we'd make payroll. We made it. Not easily and not quickly, but we made it. By the late 90s, Meridian had grown into a real precision manufacturing operation, supplying components for aerospace, medical devices, and industrial automation. In 2011, I brought on a private equity partner and restructured the company as Meridian Precision Systems, selling down to a minority stake in exchange for the capital to modernize our equipment and expand into 3 new facilities. Today, Meridian Precision Systems employs just over 1,100 people across 4 states and is valued, per last year's internal audit, at approximately $290 million. I hold 18% of that company personally, sit as chairman of the board, and I have for the last 22 years made a very deliberate choice to keep every ounce of that fact out of my grandchildren's daily awareness of who I am. That decision wasn't about secrecy for its own sake. My father grew up believing money was the only proof of a man's worth, and it destroyed him twice. Once when he lost the farm, and a second time, years later, when a small inheritance from his own father turned him into someone I barely recognized, arrogant and careless in ways he'd never been when he had nothing. I watched that transformation happen in real time as a teenager, and I promised myself that if I ever built anything of real value, my own family would learn to love the man before they ever learned the number attached to him. Doris agreed with that completely, right up until she passed 4 years ago. Our son, Mark, my grandson Ethan's father, grew up fully aware of what I'd built. Worked in the business himself for a decade before starting his own consulting firm, and understood exactly why I'd chosen to raise the grandkids at arm's length from it. Ethan, the youngest of my 4 grandchildren, was the one who never got a version of that conversation. By the time he was old enough to really understand it, I'd simply been Grandpa Frank who fixes things for so long that nobody in his generation of the family had ever bothered updating the file. I want to be fair to Ethan because I don't think he's a cruel young man. Not really. He's 22, sharp, genuinely hardworking in the ways that are visible to him. A 3.8 GPA in mechanical engineering, a work ethic he inherited honestly from somewhere in this family. even if he doesn't yet know exactly where. What he is, though, is a young man who has spent his whole life absorbing a very specific, very common kind of quiet contempt for people who work with their hands, and somewhere along the way, without anyone meaning to teach it to him directly, I became the example that contempt got hung on. It started small, the way these things usually do. As a kid, he'd get embarrassed when I picked him up from school in the truck instead of Mark's newer car. By high school, he'd started making little comments. Nothing cruel exactly, just the kind of thing a teenager says without thinking through the weight of it. "Grandpa, you could probably afford a better truck if you wanted. Did you ever think about doing something bigger with your life?" I used to laugh those off, genuinely, because from where I stood, they were almost funny. I'd built something bigger than most people in his graduating class would ever build in their careers, and my own grandson assumed I'd simply never gotten around to trying. There's one Thanksgiving about 3 years ago that I think back on now as the moment I should have said something and chose not to. Ethan was describing his college engineering program to his cousin's boyfriend, someone he'd just met, and when the conversation turned to family, he introduced me as my grandpa. He was basically a repairman his whole life, never really had much ambition, but he's a good guy. I remember sitting there at the far end of the table, holding a cup of coffee, letting that description settle over me like a coat that didn't fit. I could have corrected him right there, in front of everyone. I didn't, partly out of habit, partly because some old, stubborn part of me still believed that if he ever truly loved and respected me, it would happen because of who I actually was in a room with him, not because of a number he'd have to be told about. Looking back, I think that Thanksgiving is exactly where I made my mistake. Not in building the company quietly, in letting 3 more years pass without ever giving my grandson the chance to know the whole truth about the man he was quietly writing off. If you've ever watched someone you love slowly construct a smaller, easier version of you in their head, because the real version was inconvenient to update, you understand exactly why. On the afternoon of his graduation party, hearing him say "broke old handyman" to a recruiter from my own company didn't actually surprise me nearly as much as it probably should have. The party was at Mark's house, the backyard strung with lights, maybe 60 people milling around between the patio and the pool. Family, Ethan's college friends, a handful of people from the mechanical engineering department who'd come to celebrate his graduation, and a small cluster of people I didn't recognize at first. Standing near the food table with the particular posture of professionals who'd shown up to a family event out of genuine goodwill rather than obligation. I found out later that Ethan had accepted an offer 3 weeks earlier for an entry-level design engineer position at Meridian Precision Systems. My company, through a completely normal, unremarkable hiring pipeline that had nothing to do with me directly. He'd applied online, interviewed with the regional hiring manager, and gotten the offer on merit, the same way any of our 1,100 employees had. Nobody on the hiring side had any reason to connect an applicant named Ethan Delacroix to a chairman named Frank Delacroix because I deliberately kept my involvement in day-to-day hiring at exactly 0 for over a decade. His recruiter, a woman named Priya Anand, had come to the graduation party specifically because Ethan had mentioned it during his final interview, and she genuinely wanted to meet the family of someone she was excited to be bringing onto her team. That's the kind of person she is. I found that out properly a few weeks later. I was standing near the drinks table in my usual jacket when Ethan spotted me and waved Priya over, clearly wanting to introduce his grandfather to his new employer with a bit of pride in his own accomplishment. Pride I understood completely and, honestly, still respected even after what came next. "This is my grandpa, Frank," he said, grinning. Then, turning slightly toward Priya with the easy, careless tone of someone who has never once had to think twice about how he describes another person, he added, "Don't mind him, he's just a broke old handyman. Spent his whole life fixing stuff for people. Sweet guy, though." Priya laughed, politely, The way you laugh at a joke you don't fully understand but assume is affectionate. I laughed too, quietly, mostly at the sheer absurd shape of the moment. My own grandson introducing me to my own company's recruiter as a broke handyman, 8 feet from a cheese platter, at a party celebrating a job. He'd just gotten with my company without either of us realizing the collision that was 11 days away. I picked up my lemonade, said something forgettable and pleasant to Priya about congratulating Ethan, and walked toward the patio. I didn't confront him that day. I didn't even feel particularly angry, not in the sharp way I might have expected. What I felt was something closer to a long overdue clarity. The recognition that I'd spent 22 years protecting my grandson from a truth I decided he wasn't ready for, and that decision had quietly cost him the chance to actually know me, while costing me nothing except the discomfort of finally correcting the record. I decided, standing on that patio with a warm glass of lemonade, that I wasn't going to correct it with a conversation. I was going to let the truth arrive the way truth arrives best, on its own schedule, undeniable, in a room where nobody could laugh it off as a joke. Ethan started at Meridian Precision Systems 11 days later on a Monday in the design engineering group at our regional headquarters, a building he had genuinely never visited before, since our hiring and onboarding for that location happens almost entirely online and through the satellite office where he'd interviewed. He knew, in an abstract way, that Meridian was a big local manufacturing company. He did not know. Walking in that morning with a new badge and a coffee, he was too nervous to finish, that his grandfather's name had been on the founding paperwork of that company since before his own father was born. New employee orientation always includes a welcome video and a short address from leadership, normally pre-recorded, but that particular quarter, I happened to already be scheduled to be on site for the board meeting. Priya's team had flown me out for 11 days after that graduation party. My assistant, Renee, who has worked with me for 19 years and has a very dry sense of humor, asked if I wanted to skip the live welcome address that day and let the recording play instead, given the timing. I told her no. I told her I want to do it in person this one time, and that she should make sure Ethan Delacroix was seated in the front section of the orientation room. I watched him from the side of the stage before I walked out, chatting easily with 2 other new hires, completely relaxed, completely unaware. When I walked to the podium in a suit instead of my jacket. I do own suits. I simply choose almost never to wear them. I watched his posture change from the second row, watched him sit up straighter the way young engineers do when a chairman walks into a room, before he'd even processed whose face was above the collar. "Good morning," I said. "My name is Frank Delacroix. I founded this company in my garage in 1985 with $11,000 and 1 contract for water valve components. I still serve as chairman of the board, and I still, on the good days, know my way around a lathe better than most of the engineers we've hired in the last decade." I watched Ethan's face do something I will genuinely remember for the rest of my life. The specific slow-motion collapse of story he'd been telling himself and everyone around him for years, replaced in real time by a truth he had absolutely no framework for holding yet. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I watched him mouth something to himself, silently, that I'm fairly certain was my own last name, as though hearing it out loud for the first time. I didn't call him out. I didn't look directly at him for more than a second or 2, out of genuine mercy, not strategy. I finished the welcome address the way I always do, talking about the values the company was actually built on, patience, precision, and the belief that the person doing the work with their hands deserves exactly as much respect as the person signing the checks. I meant every word of it, and I meant it slightly more pointedly that particular morning than I usually do. He found me afterward, in the hallway outside the orientation room, white-faced, stammering out something that started as an apology and dissolved somewhere in the middle into a question he clearly hadn't planned on asking out loud. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I was waiting," I told him, for you to ask me who I actually was, instead of deciding you already knew. I didn't pull any strings for Ethan after that, and I want to be clear about that, because it would have been the easy thing to do, and it's exactly what I'd spent 22 years trying to make sure my family would never assume was available to them. I told his manager nothing beyond what I tell every new hires manager, which is nothing at all. Ethan kept his job on the same terms as every other design engineer in his cohort, subject to the same 90-day review, the same expectations, the same complete absence of shortcuts. What changed wasn't his job. It was every conversation we've had since. He asked me about 3 weeks after that orientation if he could come by the house on a Saturday, not for a family dinner, just to talk. He sat in my kitchen, the same table Doris used to do the books at 40 years ago, and asked me questions I don't think he'd ever thought to ask in 22 years of knowing me. What it actually felt like to nearly lose the company in year 6, while my own father's story had taught me why I'd chosen the truck and the jacket over everything he'd assume a man in my position was supposed to want. I answered all of it. I've been waiting a long time for someone in his generation of the family to actually ask. He apologized for the graduation party comment more than once, more than I needed him to, honestly. I told him, eventually, that the apology mattered less to me than what he did with it. That the real repair wasn't in the words, it was in whether he ever caught himself making the same quiet assumption about somebody else's worth based on what jacket they were wearing. I think he's actually taken that seriously. A few months ago, I heard from one of our floor supervisors that Ethan had spent an entire lunch break asking one of our senior machinists, a man who's been with Meridian for 26 years, genuine, curious questions about tolerance work, the kind of questions that suggested he was finally looking at the people who build things with something other than a category in his head. I still wear the jacket. I still drive the truck. Some things I built on purpose, and I'm not interested in tearing them down just because the truth got revealed a little more dramatically than I planned. But I've stopped letting the silence do the explaining for me. A few weeks ago, at a much smaller family dinner, Ethan introduced me to his girlfriend for the first time, and I listened for what he'd say. "This is my grandpa, Frank," he said. He built one of the biggest precision manufacturing companies in the state out of a garage with $11,000. And he still won't buy a new truck. I laugh harder at that than I had in a long time. 41 years of running machines and running a company taught me that precision isn't really about the number on the gauge. It's about refusing to let something drift quietly out of tolerance just because nobody's checking it closely enough to notice yet. I let my own family's understanding of me drift for 22 years, and I told myself that was patience. Looking back, I think a good part of it was just fear of what it would mean if the truth changed how they loved me, instead of trusting that the truth would only ever make it more accurate. If you've ever been quietly underestimated by someone who loved you and had to decide whether to correct them or just let the truth arrive on its own, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe because there are a lot more quiet lives and a lot more overdue reveals still to come. I'll see you in the next one.